Hi, I'm Jess Fields. Welcome to the show. The other day I spoke with progressive grassroots activist and social media influencer Allison Greene. She has over 80,000 followers on Twitter with her handle at GrassrootsSpeak and is a business person who lives in Manhattan. Greene and I spoke about the rent strike that began on May 1st, where people are declining to pay their rent during the coronavirus pandemic. Why is that? She explains. We also spoke about various issues of importance to progressives, and you'll be interested to hear her thoughts on the 2020 nomination and Bernie Sanders' role in all that. Regardless of your political views, I think you'll find this to be a very interesting interview with grassroots activist Allison Greene. This is actually part one of two. Allison's interview with me went a little bit long, so I've cut it into two different parts to make it easier to listen to and watch. Anyway, enjoy the interview. Joining me now is Allison Greene. Allison is a native New Yorker and a business person who recently has participated in several strikes, including the rent strike, and is an influencer on Twitter with over 80,000 followers and has been a vocal voice on the progressive left for the strikes and what they mean. Allison, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Jess. It's great to be here.
So I want to talk a little bit about the rent strike because that is what's just going on right now. And I think some people aren't aware of that. But before we do that, I just want to get a little bit into your biography. Could you tell us a little bit about your life in New York and what you've done and what brought you to the present point?
Sure. I actually lived overseas for about 10 years. I lived in both Australia and Hong Kong, and I moved back to New York. I'm a native New Yorker, moved back to New York City about 15 years ago. Have been working in various business positions and really very similar to a lot of people out there who got significantly woke in the 2016 election. I then kind of looked to social media to start venting my opinions, as they were, and I grew a strong following. And I think that it was really just about trying to empathize with the situation that so many people are in. So many of us are in different positions financially across the country. We come from so many different walks of lives, but I think that there's the commonality is bigger than that and connects us. And it's important to just try and empathize and see with what's going on in our country and the people who are supposed to be represented.
So let's talk a little bit about getting into social media because
Yes.
anybody that's gotten into social media knows that's kind of like you suddenly jump into a lake of a lake of fire. It's a very controversial world. There's a lot going on in social media, and you expose yourself obviously to a lot of different viewpoints and a lot of criticisms, but there's benefits as well. Your social media, by the way, just for the plug, is it's right behind you, at Grassroots Speak, which is a
Yes.
very clear handle. So obviously you have been doing it for a little while. Talk a little bit about what first made you want to get involved in the sense of actually putting your opinions out there. And what were you doing at that time that you decided, hey, you felt like you needed to put your opinions out there that way?
I was very much not into social media at all prior to Trump. But I was very engaged with some friends of mine in serious political discussions around the time of Trump coming on board. And one of the things was that really inspired me, and this is a little bit separate to the rent strike, but also related, was it was around the time of the healthcare debates that were going on. And I was watching the healthcare debates and that very important vote that was happening. And I was just very frustrated because I thought that there were some significant pieces of the puzzle that were not being represented by the media and were not being talked about, specifically the corporations and how they were contributing to our healthcare costs. And, you know, there was so much focus on, the universal healthcare versus keep what we've got versus destroy, Obamacare. And I thought there's nobody really covering the aspect of how we've gotten to this position and the lobbyists that are keeping us in that position. And so I actually started to focus on healthcare and tried to distribute what I felt was an opinion. I really was just talking to the void, and I was saying, why isn't anybody speaking about this? And that really caught on, and I was working, really focusing on bringing out facts about healthcare and bringing that discussion up. And then we had that very critical vote. We had John McCain and others step in at that time, and I realized that the issues were beyond healthcare, and that my focus needed to be more on the overall system, because with what we had in place, we were not going to be seeing the change we needed anytime soon from healthcare until we could change the bigger picture. So that led me to where I was.
So kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for your involvement, but maybe where, I guess, in your past, at some point, you obviously formed your views and you felt strongly that, hey, you had this set of views. Maybe you weren't on Twitter at the time. Of course, Twitter's only been around so long. I know really young people may forget that Twitter's only been around for, not even 15 years. But a lot of us have been on Twitter for a long time. So originally, were there any earlier movements that you participated in, or going back to your younger life before Twitter, that you were involved in any political sense?
I mean, I have to say, I was not very political. I was actually basically brought in from my own experiences. And, healthcare being the straw that broke the camel back was very important to me, because I had actually lived for 5 years in Australia before I actually came to New York. And so I actually was in Australia at a very interesting time where they were starting to introduce, it was around early 2000, I believe, where they started to introduce a supplemental private health insurance on top of the national universal health care that was offered there. So that was very important to me, because I had my own experiences. And I had actually a couple of healthcare um, issues here in the States, and was so stunned by how much it economically hurt me compared to how I had lived for the last 10 years, first 5 years in Hong Kong and 5 years in Australia. I had never dealt with the fact that a potential healthcare crisis could be such a financial impact. So I think it was those experiences more than it was, I wasn't involved with politics. I wasn't involved with that. It was just that I had experienced other governments and other approaches to healthcare and to other issues that really brought me in.
I hope I'm not too personal in asking, was that healthcare situation a situation where you were insured or uninsured, or?
Actually, I'm happy to speak about it. I don't want to get us too far off topic, but I think it is very relevant to all of the discussions that are leading to this rental strike. So I actually did have two different situations. The first one was a scare, and it was a situation where I had a potential lump that I had to have biopsied for the possible breast cancer. So I'm very lucky that I did not have breast cancer, but I had a job where I was insured. I was paying 50% of my premiums, and my employer was paying 50% of my premiums. I had a deductible of $5,000, and I had things that were out of pocket. So what I found was, thank God I didn't have breast cancer, but I had $6,000 worth of medical costs, even though I already had insurance. And having just come from Australia, where, I mean, I never paid more than $50 or $100 in a year for health insurance. It was like, how could I get to a situation where I have $6,000 and I'm not even sick? And a few years later, I did also have a situation where I was in the hospital for about 5 days. I was also covered in insurance. And again, it wound up being about $6,500 out of pocket. That time I was in the hospital, I needed the care, but all of that stunned me in terms of the financial pressure that you're under, even with insurance, to have healthcare in this country.
So prior to that, obviously that was a major catalyst for you. It sounds like
Hmm.
in developing your present viewpoint and your desire to be active.
Yeah.
Fair to say that. But prior to that, did you have a strong viewpoint one way or the other? Did you just kind of maybe weren't as concerned one way or the other, or
I mean, I think that having, spent the first 10 years of my adult life outside of the US, I wasn't as involved in US politics. And it's been kind of fascinating because coming back to the US, I was also seeing things slightly differently because I had been outside of the of the goldfish bowl, so to speak. And so I kind of had the different perspective formed from that time. But I was very much focused on my career, my business, which was all outside of politics. Yes.
very interesting. I mean, I think it's always interesting to find out kind of the formative moments, right? And a lot of people have formative moments in their various political viewpoints. So let's maybe fast forward a little bit now to what is going on at the present moment, because on May 1st, across America, many millions of Americans were due to pay rent, and they did not. From The Guardian, the headline was Thousands of Americans to Take Part in Biggest Rent Strike in Decades. State leaders urged to cancel rent for duration of crisis. Nearly 4 million Americans lost their jobs last week, figures show. And again, this from last week. Thousands of Americans plan to take part in a rent strike on Friday, calling for state leaders to cancel rent during the coronavirus crisis. And activists in New York, Pennsylvania, California are encouraging tenants to withhold rents from the Guardian. And it has been true that many thousands of people have pledged not to pay their rent. There was also an estimate previously reported that some economists were estimating as many as 1/3 of Americans were going to miss their rent payment, not necessarily even as a protest, just because they could not maybe make it. So,
Correct.
Allison
Yeah.
Greene, you have, I believe, chosen to take part in the rent strike. I want you to, if you could, please discuss that decision and explain your reasoning for that and what led you to participate in this rent strike.
Well, a couple things. I mean, number one, I think that there is a lot of focus right now on small businesses, which I appreciate, although I don't believe it's actually happening the way it's supposed to be happening. But the intention with that small businesses is that they can also keep the people employed. And I think that there's a lack of recognition for the people. And we keep falling into this trap in this country of thinking that trickle down economics is going to work, and if you bail out the large corporations and then if you have grants for small businesses, the people will be taken care of. But that's not the reality. And the reality is that, number one, the small businesses, many of them have not gotten the help that they've needed in time. And you mentioned 4 million, but there's over 30 million unemployed because some of us, myself included, it was as early as February that people started to lose their jobs because of coronavirus. So April 1st came and they put a stopgap in place which was that I'm in New York and it differs state to state, but in New York, they actually said you can't be evicted. And while I appreciate that, the reality is that there's many people, such as myself, who don't have any income, don't know when their income's going to come in, and don't know, we can't forecast when this will end, just like the government can't. And the reality is the eviction can't take place until June 20th. But on June 20th, are we expected to come up with 3 months worth of back rent when we have gotten no income?
So I want to
And that's a problem.
I want to ask you about that, but I want to go back
Sure.
to what you discussed with regards to the eviction. So you're saying on April 1st, there was kind of an eviction freeze put in
Yes.
place. Is that a statewide freeze in New York, or is that just in the city?
It's in New York, I believe.
Okay.
Although I believe it's New York State through Governor Cuomo, and I don't know that it's April 1st per se. I
Okay.
believe it was put into place on April 20th, and I
Okay.
believe it was a 90-day moratorium on evictions,
Okay.
which is up on June 20th for New
Okay.
York.
Okay.
So what that does is that puts a lot of us that, okay, we won't be thrown out of our homes right now,
Right.
but there's still the anxiety of what is going to happen June 20th. And there have been a couple of statements from Governor Cuomo, but, and on a state by state basis, it has to come from the states as to what's going to happen. And I don't think that there's enough appreciation for the anxiety that people will do, because just kicking the can down the road is not helpful. We're all scared of what would happen then on June 20th. And we need to understand what the plan is, because if the plan was to save the small businesses and the corporations and to make sure that we were kept on the payroll, that boat has sailed. There's 30 million of us who are not on payroll, who don't have jobs, and don't know when we'll be able to re-enter the work environment. And, there's companies who sit there and say, we want bailouts for our whole industry, and the American people are expected to have prepared for something like this when 40% of Americans don't have $400 in the bank for emergency expenses. You
So
know,
I want to go back to, I guess, the decision with the rent strike, because I hear you on the moratorium. So reiterating, you're saying around mid-April, April 20th, there was a 90-day moratorium in the state of New York. Sounds right. I'm not gonna. No, I don't feel the need to check that. I think you're correct, roughly on that, if not exactly. So as far as the rent strike goes. Um, Obviously there are people that just simply cannot make the
absolutely.
rent
There are people
payment.
who cannot.
And then there's also, it seems maybe a group that may also overlap with that, but then maybe just a group that is separate from that also, that is, making a decision to actually withhold rent specifically because of a desire to change certain policies. So I know that there are some lists of this, there's some numbers. You are at the front lines of this, literally being in New York on the west side of Manhattan, and also being an influencer within progressive Twitter. Could you talk a little bit about what the numbers realistically look like on the ground of the number of people, say, in New York City that aren't paying rent, and maybe around the nation that you've heard of?
The numbers I've heard, I can't say specifically to New York. I know that there was a petition that was going around that recently had about 12,000 signatures. There are people who are withholding rent without even participating in that petition. And as you said, the unfortunate situation is there are people who are not only not withholding rent due to a desire to make a political statement, but because they don't have the money. And we need to kind of get the attention of, it's not about changing a policy. This is a new world that we're in at the moment. There's no set of rules, there's no set of policies for this type of global pandemic. And we just need to get the attention of the appropriate people to say, look, it's not going to trickle down to us. You have to talk to us. You have to work for us. And we need to know when we're sitting at our kitchen tables and we're looking at each other and saying, well, how long is it going to be until we have a job? The answer is we don't know. So it's not even a choice of withholding rent per se for for kicks. It's more a case of we don't know when this is going to end. And if you're putting us in the position of having to choose between rent and survival, we have to choose survival. And, there has been a lack of communication too, that I would also say is a factor here. We don't know what's going to happen. It's not that we're asking them to change a policy. They're saying there's a policy to come and we don't know what it is.
So let's maybe key in on the political point, though, because while certainly are people that simply cannot afford to pay their rent due to job loss or what have you during this particular time with the pandemic, there are those who are participating in an organized rent strike. How many? It's difficult to say exactly. As you say, there's one petition with 12,000 signatures, and there are other places where there's other groups that have signed and individuals that have groups that have encouraged people to strike from their rent. But with that point specifically, those who are withholding rent in part to make a political point, and certainly in your situation, I mean, you seem to be wanting to make a political point, regardless of financial circumstances as well. What is that policy point that you want to make? What would be the ideal policy that you would hope would come out of this at
Sure.
the end of the tunnel?
I think that we're in a group of people that is often forgotten. So there has been a lot of talk, for example, like as a renter, I personally don't want to hurt the small business, the small landlords. I have empathy for those people and I'm not looking to hurt them. I myself am in a position where my landlord is a corporation, it's a real estate developer, and it's worth $5.4 billion. Depending on which story you read, it's somewhere around the $5 billion mark. But having said that, they're going to be taken care of in a way. And I'll get back to that in a second. The other people who are maybe the smaller landlords and, you know, they may be hurt by the strike. Um, the reality is that the policies that are being looked at for them are the ideas that the banks may be taking their mortgage payments and putting to them to the end of the loan. So for example, if somebody had 20 years left on their loan, there is talk about policy that would make it so that 3 months worth of mortgage payments can be put at the end and at the back end of the loan so that you now have 20 years and 3 months to pay off your loans. And considering how much we have bailed out the banks, I think that is something that the government is in a position to do. And I just want to make sure that if something like that is actually happening as a policy, that it's then trickling down. So somebody who is a landlord who doesn't have to pay their mortgage for 3 months needs to be passing that on to their tenants as well. So, my concern is that they're going to look at the mortgage and the banks and the loans and forget about the renters. And that's the kind of trickle down economics that I feel like we get missed. There's the assumption that if a landlord has some properties and he's able to put his 3 months worth of mortgage payments on the back end of his loan, that he will oblige his tenants. There's no guarantees of that, though. So just like there have been bailouts where they didn't concern themselves with laying off the workers, I want to make sure that if there is a policy that looks at helping the landlords, that there is an obligation for that to then turn around to the tenants themselves.
So let's say that this were a debate in Congress. Who is your congressperson, by the way?
Jerry Nadler.
Okay, Jerry Nadler. So
Yes,
certainly an influential
absolutely. I hope Jerry
individual.
will hear me.
So an influential individual in the House of Representatives. And so if Congressman Nadler
Hmm.
were to propose a bill,
Hmm.
and let's say that the bill were to address your concerns and to require something to ensure what
To
you're
require the
suggesting.
banks to put the 3 months worth of mortgage payments at the back end of a loan, for example,
Okay.
and to then require that any landlords pass that savings on to their tenants.
So when you say savings, would that be a suggestion that should landlords then absolve tenants of 3 months of rent, for example, or should they allow tenants to defer 3 months of rent to some later time?
Well,
Or
you know, well, let's look at it this way. I don't know. I'm saying this is one of the things that I've heard proposed is that people with mortgages will be able to, let's say they have a 20-year mortgage, they will tag on the other 3 months that they withhold from the bank to the end of those 20 years. Now, the tenant is not going to wait 20 years and 3 months to pay that rent to the landlord. The landlord is then, getting the benefit from the bank for them to still collect the rent means that they're ahead of the game. So that wouldn't be right. You see what I'm saying? So in other words, if the landlord, for example, if there is some kind of bill that has some kind of package that allows, um, I think it should actually be tied also to people who are unemployed. There are 30 million unemployed. If you can show unemployment, you should be able to defer, and that should also go for a landlord. Their tenant is unemployed, then their bank should move those 3 months worth of payments to the back end of the loan. So it's those types of creative solutions that I want them to be looking at. And I'm sure they have been looking at various solutions, but we should not be handing our money over until we understand what the policy is and make sure that it's not only working for the landlords and the corporations. I can tell you right now, my experience with real estate, and I worked for real estate developers. My landlord is a real estate developer. For all I know, he is currently refinancing all of his loans due to the incredibly low interest rates, and all of the money that he saves in those interest payments, he does not give any discounts to us. So we are the ones who are without the jobs, but the billionaires actually get to save money on their actual interest payments by refinancing. So we're already seeing that the low interest rates are potentially helping these landlords and these corporates, but we're not being allowed any discounts or consideration. So once again, we're left holding the bag.
so you're suggesting if maybe just so I can try to
Sure.
understand the point, if you have a landlord who has a property,
Hmm.
rental building, rental property. Obviously, in New York, this is a high rise.
Yes.
Down here in Houston, you might be a single family home, but let's say in New York, obviously a high rise, and in many other large cities. And in that case, you're saying if they have a loan and they are able to receive kind of deferred mortgage payments, that basically for whatever the period of deferred mortgage payments is, that rent should be absolved for tenants
Ones who are unemployed,
once
absolutely.
you're unemployed. And
Yeah.
so, okay. And then as far as like what happens if if you had a landlord who owned the building outright and wasn't under a loan situation, but who had unemployed tenants. Um, how would that landlord be able to, or what
Sure.
specific policy would you,
Mechanism.
right, exactly. What mechanism to maybe absolve the rents of those individuals, or would you say that's a different situation altogether?
No, I mean, I definitely want to take into consideration those things as well. I mean, so I mentioned two different things, and just to be clear, so the deferred payments on the back end of the mortgage is one way of doing it, as you just described. The other way is, so there are many, I'm going to go to the outright in a second, but I'll use my real estate developer experience to start with. When they own a building, which mine is a high rise, I literally live in a building with 800 apartments in it. And the loans on it are probably worth millions. So, with the low interest rates, what these corporations do is they go and they refinance. And by refinancing, they're actually collecting the same rent, but their payments are lower because they've taken advantage of the extremely low interest rates. So for those situations, we will once again be forgotten if we don't raise our voices to say, that's not going to work. Now, to your point, if you did have somebody who outright owned the building, then and had no mortgage payments whatsoever, there are other things that can be done to say that they're entitled to a low interest loan from the government, for example, to cover any costs for unemployed tenants who can't pay their rent, which with the low interest rates would probably be very easy for the government to do. I mean, you have a situation where I was reading just today about the cruise lines, and there's some controversy about whether the cruise lines were bailed out or not. The reality is that the federal, or the way I had understood it, is the Federal Reserve stepped up and helped them to actually get all of these very low interest loans that they wouldn't have gotten without the Federal Reserve kind of stepping in. So you can step in to ensure that people who are unemployed, which is right now 30 million of the country, and I believe there's many people who either haven't been laid off yet or haven't been getting unemployment, but start working for those people, and if in the very odd instances where you have landlords who outright own their building, if they have people who cannot pay their rent because they're unemployed, let them get a business loan, so to speak, a very low interest loan to be able to help with that. But that's the minority here. And the majority are either going to be in the first two situations where they may get their mortgages that they don't have to pay their mortgage payments, or they may be really decreasing their loan amounts, but keeping their rent the same if they don't pass on the savings to us. So, yeah, I want us to be taken into consideration because, in general, we're in a world where we're overlooked and the bailouts are happening at the corporate and the big business level.
So let's pivot a little bit and ask about kind of that point you just brought up. Of course, I discovered you on Twitter as a very prominent progressive voice on Twitter, talking about the rent strike and other issues. And of course, there are many progressives on Twitter eschewing similar feelings and detailing, specific policies that they would like to change. At the same time, the national media does not appear to be giving as much coverage to this. So it is difficult. I read the Guardian headline. It is difficult to ascertain how widespread the sentiment is about the rent strike. And perhaps we should introduce also a secondary topic that on May 1st, in addition to being the day that rent payments are usually due for most people, there was also a strike at numerous major companies, such as Amazon and several other companies with essential workers, so-called essential workers, by the
Yep.
government. So really, I suppose you could say the workers' movement seems to be burgeoning. But before we dive into that too much, how widespread is this? Because again, the media doesn't seem to be covering it very much.
No, the media, I think, is not necessarily catching the significant wealth inequality that is prevalent. And, the middle class is disappearing. We had a Wall Street, an Occupy Wall Street kind of movement that talked about the 99%, 1%. I have different political views than some of the other people who are in that 99%, but when I think what we're talking about is that this is prevalent almost 99%. The wealth inequality between the 1% and the 99% has gotten to a point where it's not sustainable. I mean, you have half of all American adults have more credit card debt than they have savings. 25% of all Americans have no savings at all. 40% of Americans don't have beyond a $400 emergency. 4 out of 5 working Americans have less than 1 year's income saved for retirement. And the reality is that we are hearing all of the time threats to Social Security, and the media is not really talking about that. This is, to me, I absolutely think that the essential worker story that we've had come out of COVID, it was something that I feel there was a fissure, and it's burst wide open. And these people are applauded as heroes, but they should never have been put into the position that it's their life or their paycheck, and they can't afford for it to not be their paycheck that they're following up on. This strike is to look at that. We have an unsustainable wealth inequality system, you know, problem with our system right now. And I think that COVID has unfortunately burst it wide open. And I wish that the media was taking a more active approach at looking at, you know, people say, well, you should have had the money for your rent to cover 2 or 3 months of emergency rent. No, the corporations shouldn't require bailouts. The American people, it's, we have been squeezed. And partly, I believe, also through the tax system. The GOP got a huge tax cut early on in Trump's thing. And, we were not a country that was built for not collecting taxes or an equal percentage of taxes from that 1% of the wealth. It's not sustainable for only the the middle class, if that is still something that exists, and lower class to be actually paying taxes, whereas somebody like a Trump pays zero, Amazon pays zero. In fact, I think they get money back. It's not something that we can run our country on. If you're not collecting the income, there is no money to go out, and they don't have much more that they can cut from us. They're cutting our health care, they're cutting our Social Security. They have to be collecting the taxes properly. They don't. So I think it's part of a bigger issue overall.
So, a lot of policy issues you raised there. The tax issue was a major issue during the Democratic presidential nomination, and progressive candidates such as Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders calling for much higher taxes on the wealthy, or the 1%, as you say, but really the wealthiest Americans. And some of the more moderate Democrats calling for a more restrained increase. What is an appropriate level of taxation on the wealthy, corporations, and so forth? Because as you point out, the government does have to collect taxes somewhere to fund things. But where do you think is an appropriate level for some of those things?
I personally always say I'd like them to start paying taxes. Let's start there because, it's not just Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders calling for it. I will tell you right now, I mean, I actually did research into my own landlord, okay? I want to hate the guy because he's a billionaire and he's not giving me any discounts in my rent and all of that. Yet he talks about the fact that he is a billionaire who should be taxed more. And you actually look, and so, by the way, he says he should be taxed more. He also does not give any discounts when people are unemployed in his places. So there's both sides of it. But you have the Giving Pledge, where so many people like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates have said that they would pay taxes. That you've got the famous lines by Warren Buffett that says he should be paying. He should not be paying less than his executive assistant. So, I don't want to get caught up in a number of how much. I want to say, take away these loopholes, because you can say that somebody has a tax rate of 20%, but if they can pay their accountants to get them out of everything and pay zero at the end, that 20% is a useless number. You have to shut down all of the loopholes and actually start collecting taxes. And for me, that's where we start. I don't want to get into these fancy plans of you need 2% of every dollar. Let's start by having a 20% corporate rate that is actually 20%, not negative zero. Or let's start with 10% and make it stick. No fancy footwork, no high corporate lawyers, no overseas accounts where the money is distributed. It can't be you're going to pay 10% on the money that you're willing to declare in the US when you're making it off of the US workers. So I won't give you a number. I won't give you a big plan. I'll say that the irony is that we have to start collecting taxes, not how much.
Well, to be fair, Allison, you're not running for president either, so you don't have to give a detailed
There
plan.
you go.
And thankfully, neither of us are running for president. That would be difficult to be sure. So,
not a job I want.
right, exactly. I think most people would share that sentiment.
Yeah.
So, going back to the why of the coverage, I mean, um, why hasn't the media covered these strikes and these sentiments that are very widely expressed on the left, on Twitter and elsewhere, and on certain independent outlets on the left, but most major news media outlets are not covering these sentiments and are certainly not covering things like the rent strike or the people's strike of May 1st. Why do you believe that is?
I think there's a couple of reasons. I think number one, there's no sensationalism to it. When we say we're on a rent strike, we're not getting our automatic weapons and storming the Capitol. We're not that sensationalist. So that is one of the things that they're chasing the shiny object, and we're not the shiny object. But I think there's another big factor here. I've thought a lot about that. I watched the media coverage, especially after the 2016 campaign, and how divided it was. But yet, I am somebody who came onto Twitter and I considered myself a resistor. You didn't hear about resistors on media. You heard about Trump's base 1,000 times a day. They were the ones who were covered. The resistors are not. And I thought a lot about that. And I think the fact is that all of these media outlets are owned by individuals and oftentimes individual companies, that it is not in their best interest. So you've got, the lobbyists who are looking out for their interests. And then you've got these corporate entities who, they don't need lobbyists. They can control their media narrative. And I mean, I have seen, media outlets where the anchors look as though they want to be speaking out more. And I don't know if there's a memo from the top, but I do think that um, that there's maybe some self-interest there in terms of the 1% that I mentioned are really the ones who own these media outlets. So there's not much benefit to giving the 99% that vehicle to get their voices heard. I mean, that's why I love how social media has evolved for me personally.
So social media, you're saying, has kind of opened it up and allowed you to bypass the media. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I actually had set up a Twitter account because that was what you did when you set up a LinkedIn account. And I had it for years that it was dormant. And, I think people had followed me. So when I actually looked to get onto social media, I remember exact time because it was July 4th weekend, 2017. And I thought, how do I celebrate Independence Day when I feel like the thing that we were actually trying to become independent from, I mean, the Declaration of Independence is all about tyranny. And I was feeling like we were entering that kind of same zone. How do I celebrate Independence Day? And that's when I decided to kind of start tweeting about my healthcare ideas. And what I found was it resonated. So I went from having 9 people on social media July 4th, 2017. I'm now over 80,000 people on Twitter. And I think it's because I'm not edited. I don't have an agenda. And I'm able to say what I want to say. And there are some other great people on Twitter as well who are doing the same thing. We don't have an agenda. We don't have somebody who's telling us you can't say that. And we're able to express things that many people are relating to.
Well,
So yeah, it's powerful.
Allison, so I think it'd
Mm.
be interesting. I mean, who are some of the people on Twitter that you feel are representing a viewpoint similar to yours, who you respect and would want to maybe give a shout out to? Could you name a few of those?
Sure. I mean, it varies. I mean, I see women like Joyce Vance White, I believe it is, and Barb McQuaid, and and then you've got Glenn Kirshner. When I see their stuff, it resonates in a legality kind of way. They're the ones I look to for the legalities of from a legal perspective. This is what can and can't be done. That's tremendous. Then I have, I actually in New York, there's a couple of other people who tweet regularly. Somebody like a Brooklyn Defiant, he has a very similar groove to me. We were in a similar headspace. You've got Scott Dworkin with Thunder. You've got Bryce Tashi. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, on another part of the country. You've got some great people, Amy Siskind and some others. So those are the ones off of the top of my head. I apologize if I did or didn't mention anybody. But it's very, a lot of times I see a different side of the story, but also so much news that I see is covered on Twitter before it's eventually covered in the media, if at all. And it's because we're all scouring other sources. I mean, I recently found, and I don't want to fall into the conspiracy theory kind of conversations, but I did not know, I don't know if you knew, that Trump has spoken on the phone to Putin 4 times since March 30th. But if you actually look at his schedule, you can't see that. That's not what's being reported in the US press, but it's actually being, presented overseas. And then you do have confirmations. Those 4, it could have been more, but those 4 have all been verified by Trump himself or by the White House. So I'm confident to say that much. But the point is they're not getting covered in the media. I think that people might want to know that governors who are working so hard on the COVID epidemic and working on behalf of their states may not be getting the same amount of time as a world leader. I mean, I just found out that there was a COVID world leader meeting that the US has elected not to attend. I don't know that I would have seen that in other sources. So you get a lot of the international reporting that you can find on Twitter too.
And that was part one of a two-part interview with progressive activist Allison Greene. Now, in the second part, she talks about Bernie Sanders, as well as expounds a little bit more on Twitter and the media and some other progressive issues of import and life under quarantine in Manhattan. I think you will find it to be very interesting as well. Remember, if you enjoy the show, please remember to subscribe on YouTube or in your favorite podcast app. And if you have a guest idea, email me at jessfieldsshow@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.